I certainly have a very strong sense that history is repeating itself. History does repeat itself, but of course never exactly. I think the film of the 1930s is running, or rather the sequel to the film of the 1930s, because of course it's a slightly different film that is running now in the early 21st centuries. I think it is running. I think it's also running in slower motion than the original, and that is perhaps disarming people, many people, not least people on the left, actually, as to the seriousness of what is now unfolding. This, in a sense, represents a regression to what I shall call pre-Enlightenment, because I think the tradition of the Enlightenment in current circumstances has to be defended. A regression to pre-Enlightenment, blood and soil mysticism. I'm always struck by the way in which the Russian revolutionary Leon Trotsky described fascism when he was trying to make sense of it in the 1930s. He said fascism is the marriage of the technology of the 20th century with the myths of the 10th century. And that's always struck me as being a brilliant encapsulation of what it is. It involves, therefore, attacks on science, on truth, and reason. And these things have to be defended in the current context. And this is where I begin to get to grips with the difficult, the complex psychological problem that's my focus this afternoon. There is an epidemic of narcissism, which is rooted in the system, and an epidemic of mass psychotic rage, which arises in the context of the system entering crisis. Or, to put that in classical Freudian terms, we are witness to a return of the repressed on a mass social scale, much as we saw in the 1930s. We are witness more generally, not just psychologically, but also socially and politically, to a process that we describe as creeping fascism. And we describe it as that because we think the way in which fascism is unfolding in the early 21st century has significant differences from the way in which it unfolded in the interwar period, but the fundamentals are essentially the same. So, there is an attempt to, if you like, return to, synthesize the work of Marx and Freud in the understanding of the human personality, and in particular the human personality in the context of the rise of fascism. And I am going to make reference primarily to the work of Wilhelm Reich as my sort of exemplar, if you like, of the attempt to do this in relation to the fascist experience of the interwar period. I've used the title of his book, The Mass Psychology of Fascism, as the title of my talk. I do think that his work on fascism in the 1930s is of value. Reich rooted the fascist mentality in the repression which took place in the bourgeois family, the patriarchal authoritarian family, as he described it. He talked about the way in which this repression within the family encouraged a personality that was conformist, that was obedient, that was respectful of authority, that was easily overawed by authority. And he talked about the connection between the sexual repression that he saw rooted in the family and a sensual rigidity and a character armour, the neurotic personality that he saw around him in interwar Germany that was responding positively to the messages of the Nazis. He talked about a fear of freedom linked with a worship of authority, and the two things, of course, are opposite sides of the same coin. And he saw that translating, that kind of psychology rooted in the repressive structures of the family and society more generally. He saw that as giving rise to a personality that responded to the appeal of order, tradition, patriarchy, the status quo, and so on. And that is the psychic basis for Reich of fascism. The individual who responds to blood and soil mysticism and follows the leadership of the great little man. The little man who in a sense becomes the leader because he is the embodiment of the littleness of a shriveled human psyche. I think that the world we are now living in is radically different from the world of the 1920s and 1930s in all sorts of ways. I think we're living in a very parasitic world in the way in which capitalism has developed. We're living in a kind of bubble economy based on debt, based on financialization, where the huge bulk of capital investment now takes the form of financialization, a very parasitic kind of capitalism, which is the framework within which we are operating. More importantly for our story, we are probably experiencing levels of a hollowing out of society which are unprecedented. And what I mean by that is the degree to which communities have broken down, social grouping has broken down, people have been atomized. And I think a significant shift took place in the 1980s with the breaking of trade union organisation effectively across the world. And that breaking of trade union organisation did actually represent a decisive shift in power from communities organised in their own defence to corporate capital, so that the individual is possibly more isolated, more dissociated than ever before in human history. And I think we're in a political void. I think we're in a world where parliamentary democracy has, to all intents and purposes, broken down. Broken down in the sense that there is no meaningful relationship now between the popular will, the public will, and what actually transpires through the institutions of liberal parliamentary democracy. There's a sense of disempowerment linked, again, I think, with the breaking of labour organisation, the breaking of working class organisation as a kind of social force that is represented in the unions and represented in socialist parties, social democratic parties. I rather like this expression, which, believe it or not, comes from one of H.G. Wells's 2 or 3 early novels. H.G. Wells, who became a very successful novelist, he actually started life as a draper's assistant in a dead-end town in southeast England, and he used this expression to describe life, crawling up a drain pipe until you die, which is perhaps the nature of many people's experience in modern neoliberal capitalism. You work and you consume is a person who is consuming large quantities of goods and services. Atomization of workers and of people in society, resulting in astronomical levels of alienation, higher levels of sort of alienation than we have experienced before. And I'm going to just throw in another term, and I also draw this from, I mean, if the term alienation is drawn primarily from Marxist sociology, the term anomie is drawn from Durkheimian sociology, but it's a useful term. It's this idea that there is a lack of values, a lack of norms, a lack of anchoring in the social space in terms of purposeful activity and so on and so forth. These, if you like, it seems to me, characterises the human experience under neoliberal capitalism. And we can draw on Marx's theory of alienation in getting a better handle on this. Marx did his first work actually on alienation. The foundation block of Marxism is really his work on alienation. He talks about alienation from the labour process, where he sees the labour process as absolutely fundamental to the human condition, that we engage in collective creative labour. That's fundamental to what we are. And that stops happening when production is a process controlled by others. We are therefore, he argues, alienated from the products of our labour, which confront us as an alien force. The banks, the corporations, the factories, the offices, the call centres, they confront us as an alien force. We're alienated from other people because we're not working with them in cooperative groups, and all of this adds up to an alienation from what we fundamentally are as a species which is defined by its sociability, by the way in which it works in groups, collectively, and so on. I think as well that it's possible to create connections between what Marx is saying about alienation and what some psychoanalysts and psychiatrists have had to say about the human experience in modern capitalism. I'm going to make reference to another controversial figure, perhaps somewhat less controversial than Wilhelm Reich, but controversial nonetheless, because I think that Lang's, his sort of most seminal work, which I think is the early work, The Divided Self, where he's of course concerned with the understanding of psychosis. He talks about the way in which the psychotic fears engulfment, fears an internal implosion, fears the petrification of his being. I think what he's describing in psychological terms is the human response to alienation, the human response to a world which seems to be a world with which one cannot connect as a social being, which one experiences as a threat, and from which one therefore is therefore withdrawing. The neoliberal dystopia, it seems, is all about bourgeois civilization's 200-year war on society and therefore on the psyche, because that is what it is. And I think neoliberal capitalism, the latest development of capitalism, represents the highest form of this alienation, where we have a society of atomized workers and privatized consumers, and that is where they want us, that's how they want us, that is how we are to be exploited and treated. We have historic levels of social dissociation, a crisis of individualism, a crisis of isolation, and a crisis of loneliness in consequence. And that brings me really to the narcissistic authoritarian personality that I want to talk about. Rather than thinking simply in terms of the authoritarian personality of Reich and the Frankfurt School as the basis of fascism, I want to suggest to you that the basis of second generation fascism, second wave fascism, is a narcissistic authoritarian personality. A personality that is rigid, that is mechanical, that is conformist, that is obedient, that is fundamentally insecure. A personality that is individualistic, self-centered, consumption-oriented, image-obsessed. A personality that is withdrawn. This is Love Island, for those who aren't familiar. This is the level of bourgeois civilization in the early 21st century, Love Island. The narcissistic authoritarian personality is withdrawn, dissociated, asocial, inattentive, disengaged, superficial. Does one feel that one knows these people? The narcissistic authoritarian personality believes in imagined communities that don't exist, like nations, invented traditions that are all constructs of recent history, conspiracy theories that are explaining why we're all under threat. They believe, he believes, she believes in a non-existent past threatened by a non-existent enemy, and they follow the leadership, deeply insecure, follow the leadership of great little men, and it's usually men, leaders as devoid of intellect, idealism and integrity as themselves. I said earlier on that I was interested. I've only just started reading Lang, again actually after a very long break, so I'm only just beginning to re-engage with Lang, but it seems to me that his ideas about, based on his work with psychotics, that there's a relevance here. The withdrawn, insecure, self-obsessed, narcissistic personality who experiences the social world as hostile and threatening. Is that not a description of so very many people? Feeling threatened, feeling that the world is hostile, therefore harbours a psychotic rage, seeking an object. The sundering of society and the psyche by bourgeois individualism. Bourgeois individualism has made us sick. Neoliberal capitalism has brought that to its highest level, the highest level we've seen historically of atomization, of alienation, and of anomie. And the result of that, I'm suggesting, is a particular personality type, resulting in an epidemic of narcissism, of selfishness, of authoritarianism because of the underlying insecurity, and of rage, directed at those who are perceived to be a threat, or forces perceived to be threatening. I think the essence of healthy libido, the healthy psyche, is that it is outward going, that it's object directed, and drawing on the insights of Rank and Ferenczi, it's striving for union through both love and labour. And what we're seeing in the narcissistic authoritarian personality, which I take to be the psychic basis for second wave fascism, contemporary fascism, represents an infantile regression to an insecure self-obsession in the context of the pervasive atomization, alienation and anomie in modern neoliberal society.